In seat 14A of United Flight 442, a quiet woman reading a paperback novel was about to face a crisis that would shatter 4 years of carefully constructed anonymity. What started as a routine red-eye flight to Frankfurt took a shocking turn when sophisticated electronic warfare attacks targeted their aircraft above the North Atlantic. Claire Donovan wasn't your typical business consultant. For over a decade, she had spent her life as an elite military signals analyst and tactical coordinator, known for developing countermeasures that saved hundreds of lives in covert operations. When she encountered military radio chatter revealing coordinated jamming attacks on civilian aircraft, she had no idea she was about to reclaim an identity she'd tried to abandon. Claire's decision to step forward and assume tactical command would lead to the most sophisticated electronic warfare operation of her career. What began as an anonymous passenger's quiet journey would become a legendary reunion between Spectre and the Squadron that still revered her name. The North Atlantic military corridor would never be the same after pilots across multiple units rose in unified recognition of the ghost who had returned to save them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The departure-gated Reagan National buzzed with the familiar chaos of evening travelers, businessmen checking their BlackBerries one last time, families juggling carry-ons and restless children, flight attendants rolling their crew bags with practiced efficiency. Claire Donovan sat in the corner of Gate B7, her paperback copy of The Kite Runner open in her lap, though her eyes tracked the movement around her with the kind of peripheral awareness that most people never developed. She looked like any other passenger waiting for Flight 442 to Frankfurt. Khaki slacks, navy sweater, sensible walking shoes. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup except a touch of lip balm. Everything about her appearance suggested someone traveling for business or perhaps visiting relatives. Unremarkable, forgettable, exactly as she intended. Final boarding call for United Flight 442 to Frankfurt, Germany. Claire closed her book, tucked it into her small leather messenger bag, and joined the line. Her boarding pass showed seat 14A, window, over the wing where she could see the engines and the horizon in equal measure. She'd specifically requested it when booking 3 weeks ago, paying extra for the privilege of controlling one small variable in a journey she couldn't entirely predict. The Boeing 767 felt smaller than it looked from the terminal, but Claire moved down the aisle with easy confidence of someone accustomed to tight spaces and regulated environments. She found row 14 and slid past the middle seat occupant, a man in his 30s with sandy hair and an expensive laptop bag, to claim her spot by the window. "Excuse me," the man said as she settled in. "I'm Ethan Marshall." He offered a friendly smile and an extended hand. "Looks like we're neighbors for the next 8 hours." Claire accepted the handshake briefly. "Claire," she said, then immediately turned her attention to organizing her small collection of carry-on items. The book, a bottle of water, noise-canceling headphones that had seen better days. Ethan seemed undeterred by her reserved response. "First time to Frankfurt? I'm heading there for work. I'm a journalist, covering a NATO conference. Always makes for interesting travel when you're flying into a story, you know?" "Business trip," she replied, which was technically true. The kind of business that involved cleaning up loose ends from a life she'd tried to leave behind, but business nonetheless. She noticed Ethan watching as she performed what appeared to be casual observations, noting the location of emergency exits, counting rows from her seat to the nearest one, glancing at the flight attendants as they moved through their pre-flight routine. These weren't the nervous tics of an anxious flyer, but the methodical assessments of someone who habitually calculated contingencies. "You seem pretty comfortable flying. Military background, maybe?" Claire's hand stilled for just a moment over her seatbelt buckle. "Something like that," she said, then pulled out her book and opened it pointedly. From the cockpit, Captain Daniel Ruiz completed his pre-flight checklist with the thoroughness of someone who'd made this run dozens of times, but never took it for granted. At 48, he'd been flying commercial routes for 12 years since leaving the Air Force, and the transition from F-16s to passenger jets still felt surreal some days. Tonight felt different, though, a restlessness he couldn't quite identify. "Weather looks good all the way across," his co-pilot, First Officer Chen, reported. "Should be a smooth flight." Ruiz nodded, but something in his peripheral vision caught his attention, a brief notation on the passenger manifest that the gate agent had handed him. Nothing unusual, just the standard list of names and special requests, but for some reason his eyes lingered on seat 14A, Donovan, C. The name didn't mean anything to him specifically, but it carried a weight he couldn't place. "Tower, United 442 ready for takeoff?" "United 442, you're cleared for takeoff. Have a safe flight." The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and Claire felt the familiar pressure of acceleration push her back into her seat. She watched the lights of Washington fall away below them, the familiar pattern of suburbs and highways giving way to the darker spaces between cities. Beside her, Ethan had opened his laptop and was typing notes, occasionally glancing out the window with the enthusiasm of someone who still found flying exciting. "Amazing, isn't it?" he said during a pause in his typing, "how something this heavy can just lift off?" Claire smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she'd allowed since boarding. "Physics," she said. "Bernoulli's principle. The shape of the wing creates different air pressure above and below. Lift exceeds weight, and up we go." "Ah, so you are technical. Engineering?" "I read," she said, then returned to her book. But Ethan had caught something in her tone, not the explanation of someone who'd read about flight, but the casual precision of someone who'd lived it. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, offering pillows and blankets, taking drink orders. Claire requested black coffee and returned to her reading, though Ethan noticed she seemed to be reading the same page for an unusually long time. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, not with the idle curiosity of a tourist, but with the focused attention of someone monitoring conditions. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the North Atlantic, the first signs of trouble began as little more than vibrations, the kind of turbulence that made passengers pause their conversations and flight attendants secure loose items. Claire felt it before most others did, her body responding to the subtle changes in engine rhythm and cabin pressure with the kind of awareness that came from experience in less comfortable aircraft. The overhead lights flickered once, briefly, and she noticed several passengers glance up nervously. But it was the faint change in the pilot's voice over the intercom that caught her full attention. "Folks, this is Captain Ruiz. We're encountering some unexpected weather patterns ahead, so we're going to climb to a higher altitude to find smoother air. Please keep your seatbelts fastened, and we should have you past this rough patch shortly." Standard announcement, delivered with professional calm. But Claire heard the slight tightness in Ruiz's voice, the kind that suggested the weather wasn't the only concern occupying his thoughts. A few rows ahead, a child began to cry, not the ordinary fussiness of travel, but the sharp wail of fear. Without thinking, Claire unbuckled her seatbelt and moved forward. "Hey there," she said softly to the young girl, maybe 6 years old, who was gripping her mother's arm. "It's just the airplane saying hello to the clouds. Sometimes they bump into each other like friends do." The child looked up at her with wide eyes. "It's scary." Claire knelt in the aisle, ignoring the turbulence that made the position challenging. "Do you want to know a secret about airplanes? They're tougher than they seem. This one has been flying for years and years through all kinds of weather. The pilots up front, they've done this thousands of times. They know exactly how to keep us safe." Her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to calm not just the child, but several nearby passengers who had been listening. The little girl nodded solemnly. "There you go. Just listen to the engines. Hear how steady they sound? That's them doing their job perfectly." As she returned to her seat, Ethan studied her with undisguised curiosity. "You're good with kids." "I've had practice with scared people," she said, then caught herself. Too much information. She buckled her seatbelt and picked up her book again, but Ethan had noticed the slip. In the cockpit, Captain Ruiz was dealing with more than weather. The navigation system was showing intermittent glitches, nothing catastrophic, but unusual enough to warrant attention. More concerning were the radio transmissions they'd been picking up on military frequencies, coded chatter that suggested unusual activity in their flight corridor. "What do you think?" Chen asked, monitoring the instruments. "Some kind of exercise?" Ruiz frowned. In his Air Force days, he'd learned to distinguish between routine military operations and something more urgent. This felt like the latter. "Put in a request to Gander for military monitoring," he decided. "If there's something going on up here, I want to know about it." The transmission went out, a routine request for enhanced radar coverage during their transatlantic crossing, standard procedure when conditions warranted extra caution. But as the acknowledgement came back, Ruiz heard something that made his blood run cold, fragments of coded radio chatter that included references he thought he'd forgotten. In seat 14A, Claire heard it too. Her book slipped closed as she focused on the faint static coming through the cabin's audio system, not intended for passenger ears, but audible if you knew how to listen. Military radio protocol, call signs, reference codes that belonged to a world she'd tried to leave behind. "You okay?" Ethan asked, noticing her sudden tension.
"Fine," she said, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the armrest. The first indication of real trouble came at 39,000 feet, somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, when the cabin lights dimmed and came back at half power. Captain Ruiz's voice came over the intercom again, but this time even trained professionalism couldn't completely mask his concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor electrical fluctuations, nothing that affects flight safety, but we're going to request an escort from our friends in the military, just as a precaution. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Claire's head snapped up from her book. An escort. That meant Ruiz had escalated their situation beyond routine assistance. It meant someone on the ground, or in the air, considered their flight worth protecting. The turbulence intensified, but this wasn't weather. Claire could feel it in the way the aircraft responded, the subtle wrongness in the vibration patterns. This was interference, deliberate and sophisticated. Her mind immediately began running through possibilities. Jamming, spoofing, electromagnetic warfare tactics she'd studied and countered years ago in a different life. Ethan noticed her change in posture immediately. Where moments before she'd been the picture of casual travel, now she sat with the alertness of a sentinel, head slightly tilted, as if listening to sounds beyond normal hearing range. "What is it?" he asked. Before she could respond, static burst through the cabin's audio system. Not the controlled communication of air traffic control, but the sharp chatter of military radio. Most passengers probably dismissed it as technical difficulties, but Claire heard the coded transmissions with perfect clarity. "Falcon Leader, this is Tower. We have a civilian aircraft requesting assistance in Grid 77. Authentication codes follow." "Tower, Falcon Leader. Confirming civilian escort mission. What's the nature of the threat assessment?" "Unknown interference patterns. Possible hostile electronic countermeasures in the corridor." Claire's hands went cold. Electronic countermeasures. Someone was actively targeting aircraft in their flight path, using sophisticated jamming techniques that could disrupt navigation and communication systems. The kind of tactics that required military-grade equipment and substantial technical expertise. More concerning was what came next over the radio chatter. "Tower, we're showing anomalous radar signatures. Civilian flight is not alone up there." Ethan leaned toward her. "You understand what they're saying, don't you?" Claire turned to look at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her careful mask of anonymity slipped completely. Her eyes held the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "We're not in danger yet, but we're moving into a situation that could become dangerous very quickly." "How do you know that?" Before she could answer, Captain Ruiz's voice cut through the cabin again, but this time he wasn't addressing the passengers. A communication mix-up had left the cabin intercom open to cockpit radio traffic, and his next transmission went directly to the military controllers and to every passenger with ears sharp enough to understand its significance. Military control, this is United 442, requesting immediate authentication for passenger in seat 14A. Need to verify identity for Spectre. The word hung in the recycled air of the cabin like a physical presence. Claire felt every muscle in her body go rigid. Around her, passengers continued their quiet conversations or dozed fitfully, oblivious to what had just been transmitted. But in the cockpit, Captain Ruiz was staring at his passenger manifest with the dawning recognition of someone who'd placed a half-remembered name with a legend he'd thought was myth. Ethan stared at her. Spectre? Claire closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something fundamental had changed. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 4 years dissolved like morning fog, replaced by the quiet authority of someone whose name still carried weight in places that mattered. Yes, she said simply. But even as she acknowledged the identity she'd tried to abandon, static filled the cabin speakers again, and this time the military response was immediate and unmistakable. United 442, confirm Spectre on board. All available units, priority Alpha response. Falcon Squadron, maintain protective formation. We have a national asset in flight. National asset. Claire almost smiled at the bureaucratic language, but there was nothing amusing about what came next. The sound of jet engines approaching from multiple vectors, the distinctive whistle of military aircraft moving to intercept their position. Her quiet flight to Frankfurt had just become something else entirely. The cabin fell into an odd pocket of silence as the military chatter faded from the speakers. Most passengers remained oblivious to what had just transpired. But Ethan Marshall stared at Claire with the wide-eyed recognition of a journalist who just stumbled onto the story of his career. Spectre, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not a normal code name for civilian contractors. Claire didn't respond immediately. She was listening to the sound of approaching aircraft, counting engine signatures with the practiced ear of someone who'd once coordinated missions involving dozens of military assets. At least 4 jetters, possibly 6, moving into protective formation around their commercial flight. The kind of response reserved for heads of state or critical intelligence assets. It's not, she finally admitted. 2 rows ahead, a businessman in an expensive suit turned around, his face creased with confusion. Excuse me, did the pilot just say something about military escort? Are we in some kind of danger? Before Claire could deflect, Captain Ruiz's voice cut through the cabin again, but this time he was speaking directly to the passengers, with the careful tone of someone trying to manage information without causing panic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to unusual atmospheric conditions affecting our navigation systems, we've been assigned a military escort as a standard safety precaution. There is no immediate danger to our flight. However, I need to speak with the passenger in seat 14A. Please identify yourself to the flight crew. Every head in the vicinity turned toward Claire. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical presence, the carefully constructed anonymity of 4 years dissolving in real time. The flight attendant was already moving down the aisle, her professional smile masking obvious confusion about why a passenger would be specifically requested by military controllers. "Ma'am," the attendant said when she reached row 14, "the captain needs to speak with you." Claire unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, aware that her every movement was now being scrutinized by fellow passengers who moments before had dismissed her as just another traveler. As she followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit, she heard the whispered speculation beginning behind her. "What do you think that's about? Maybe she works for the government." Spectre. Isn't that some kind of spy name? In the cockpit, Captain Ruiz turned as she entered, and she saw the moment recognition fully dawned in his eyes. He'd been an Air Force pilot for 8 years before transitioning to commercial aviation, and now the half-remembered briefings and whispered legends were clicking into place. "Jesus," he said softly,
You're really her, the Spectre. I was, a long time ago. Not that long ago if they're scrambling half the Atlantic Fleet to escort us, First Officer Chen observed, monitoring the radio chatter. Ma'am, we're showing 6 F-18s in formation around us, with more inbound. Whatever you did back then, somebody upstairs still considers it important. Through the cockpit windows, Claire could see the navigation lights of the escort fighters, precise points of light maintaining perfect formation in the darkness. It was both reassuring and deeply unsettling, a reminder that her reputation had never truly faded, even as she'd tried to disappear into civilian life. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission. United 442, this is Falcon Leader. We have Lieutenant Sarah Patel requesting direct communication with Spectre. Please advise if passenger is available for secure channel. Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach. Lieutenant Sarah Patel, call sign Valkyrie. She'd heard that name in intelligence briefings, read her service record during her final months of active duty. A brilliant pilot, part of a new generation that had grown up hearing stories about Spectre's missions, treating her like some kind of legend. Put her through, Claire said. Ruiz handed her the headset, and for the first time in 4 years, Claire Donovan prepared to speak as Spectre. Spectre, this is Valkyrie. Ma'am, it's an honor. The voice coming through the headset was young, professional, but Claire could hear the undercurrent of awe that Lieutenant Sarah Patel was trying to suppress. It was the tone reserved for meeting childhood heroes, and it made Claire's chest tighten with emotions she'd spent years trying to bury. Valkyrie, Claire replied, settling into the familiar rhythm of military communication. What's our situation? Ma'am, we're tracking sophisticated electronic warfare signatures in your flight corridor. Someone's running coordinated jamming operations targeting civilian aircraft. The interference patterns, they match tactics from the Montenegro incident. Claire's breath caught. The Montenegro incident, 3 years ago, just before she'd requested discharge from active duty. A terrorist cell had nearly brought down a passenger jet using military-grade jamming equipment, and Claire was the one to identify and counter their tactics. She'd saved 247 lives that day, but the mission had cost her something she couldn't quantify. It was why she'd walked away. Same equipment signatures? She asked. Negative, ma'am. More advanced. Whoever's doing this learned from Montenegro and upgraded their capabilities. Of course they had. Claire closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of tactical analysis settling over her thoughts. In the space of a few seconds, she was processing probability matrices, threat assessments, and countermeasure protocols with the efficiency that had made her indispensable to her old unit. Valkyrie, I need current positioning on the interference source. Are we dealing with ground-based jamming or airborne assets? Both, ma'am. We're tracking at least 3 aircraft maintaining parallel course at distance, plus what appears to be a ship-based transmission platform approximately 40 nautical miles northeast. Captain Ruiz listened to the exchange with growing amazement. The quiet woman who'd been reading in seat 14A was now speaking with the clipped precision of someone conducting a strategic briefing, her questions revealing a depth of technical knowledge that belonged to a very different world than commercial aviation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Ma'am, with respect, we're not authorized to take tactical direction from civilian passengers. Claire almost smiled. Valkyrie, patch me through to your squadron commander. There was a brief pause, then, Ma'am, that would be Colonel Briggs. He's specifically requested to speak with you. The name hit Claire like a physical blow. Colonel Marcus Briggs, her former commanding officer, and the one person who'd fought hardest against her request for discharge. They'd clashed repeatedly over her unconventional methods, her tendency to bend rules when lives were at stake. But he'd also been the one to recognize her unique capabilities and push for her advancement through the ranks. Put him through, she said. Static cleared, and then a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years filled the cockpit. Well, well, the ghost returns to haunt us. Hello, Marcus. Spectre. I'd say it's good to hear your voice, but given the circumstances, I'm guessing you'd rather be anywhere else right now. You always were perceptive, she replied. What do you need from me? Same thing I always needed from you. That brilliant tactical mind of yours. We've got a complex electronic warfare scenario playing out around your flight, and my best analysts are stumped. These aren't garden-variety terrorists with stolen equipment. This is sophisticated, coordinated, and it's targeting civilian aircraft specifically. Claire felt the familiar electric sensation of her mind engaging with a tactical puzzle. Despite everything, her exhaustion, her desire for anonymity, her determination never to return to this life, she couldn't ignore the intellectual challenge or the lives at stake. Send me the technical specifications, all of them. In the passenger cabin, Ethan Marshall watched the empty seat beside him and tried to process what he'd witnessed. The woman who'd quietly deflected his questions for 3 hours was now in the cockpit conducting what sounded like a military briefing. Other passengers were growing restless, their conversations peppered with nervous speculation about the military escort and the mysterious summons of their seatmate. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced calm, offering reassurance and additional beverages, but even they couldn't entirely mask their uncertainty about the unusual circumstances. Sir, the lead flight attendant stopped at row 14. The captain asked me to inform you that your traveling companion will be occupied for a while. Is there anything you need? Ethan looked up at her. Can you tell me what's really going on? The attendant's professional smile flickered briefly. I'm sure the captain will provide updates as appropriate, sir. But Ethan had been a journalist long enough to read between the lines. The military response was too swift, too coordinated for a routine navigation issue. And the way the flight crew now looked toward the cockpit, not with confusion, but with something approaching deference, told him that whatever Claire Donovan was doing up there was far beyond the scope of passenger assistance. In the cockpit, Claire studied the technical data streaming across the aircraft's communication system. Colonel Briggs had patched her into the squadron's tactical network, and for the first time in 4 years, she was looking at real-time intelligence from multiple military assets. The patterns she saw made her blood run cold. Marcus, this isn't random jamming. Look at the timing sequences. They're specifically targeting aircraft at cruising altitude during the most vulnerable phase of transatlantic crossing. Meaning? They're not trying to bring down planes immediately. They're creating navigation confusion that forces aircraft off standard flight paths into areas where they can be collected. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. This wasn't terrorism in the traditional sense. It was a coordinated operation to capture specific flights, possibly for ransom or to extract particular passengers. The kind of sophisticated operation that required months of planning and significant resources. How many other flights are currently affected? Claire asked. Briggs's voice tightened. At least 7 that we know of, all civilian, all transatlantic routes. Inspector, 2 of them have already diverted to unscheduled airports. We lost contact with both of them about an hour ago. Claire felt her tactical instincts fully engaged for the first time in years. They're testing the system, she said, using the smaller flights to refine their approach before targeting something bigger. Bigger like a Frankfurt-bound flight with 247 passengers? Exactly. Claire studied the interference patterns more closely, her mind automatically running through countermeasure protocols she had developed years ago. But they made one mistake, Marcus. They assumed civilian aircraft wouldn't have access to military-grade tactical analysis. Meaning they built their jamming network to counter standard commercial navigation systems. They didn't account for someone who knows how their own equipment works. Captain Ruiz, listening to the exchange, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that they apparently had an expert helping them navigate the crisis, and apprehension at what that expertise revealed about the scope of the threat they faced.
What do you need from us? He asked.
Claire looked at him, and he saw in her eyes the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years making decisions under extreme pressure. "I need you to trust me completely for the next 30 minutes," she said, "and I need your permission to give tactical directions to the military squadron protecting us." "You have it." The transformation in Claire's voice when she addressed the military frequency was immediate and complete. The careful restraint of civilian conversation vanished, replaced by the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "All Falcon units, this is Spectre. I'm assuming tactical coordination for defensive operations around United 442. Acknowledge." One by one, the pilots responded with textbook precision. "Falcon 2, acknowledge. Falcon 3, roger." The formality in their voices spoke to more than professional discipline. It was the recognition of authority earned through reputation rather than rank. Lieutenant Patel's voice cut through the static. "Ma'am, Colonel Briggs is requesting you brief the entire squadron on threat assessment and countermeasures. Patch me through to all units." Claire took a breath, feeling the weight of command settle over her shoulders like an old coat she'd thought she'd outgrown. When she spoke, it was with the confidence of someone who'd guided similar operations through crisis to resolution. "Falcon Squadron, Spectre. Here's what we're dealing with. Coordinated electronic warfare operation targeting civilian aircraft over the North Atlantic. Primary objective appears to be force diversion for unknown purposes. Secondary objective may be testing defensive responses to refine future operations." She paused, letting the implications sink in, then continued. "The jamming network consists of 3 airborne platforms maintaining triangulated coverage, plus a sea-based transmission station providing signal amplification. Current tactics suggest they're preparing to intensify interference and force our flight off course. Spectre, Falcon Leader, what's your recommended response?" The question carried weight beyond its technical implications. Colonel Briggs was officially asking for her tactical assessment, but unofficially, he was offering her something she'd thought she'd lost forever: the opportunity to prevent disaster through the application of skills she'd spent years perfecting. "Coordinated disruption of their triangulation network," Claire replied, without hesitation. "Falcon 2 and 3, move to intercept airborne platforms Charlie and Delta. Don't engage unless they show hostile intent, but break their positioning advantage. Falcon 4 through 6, establish suppression pattern around the sea-based platform. And the primary jamming signal." Claire smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. United 442, I need access to your navigation system." Captain Ruiz hesitated. "Ma'am, with respect, that's against every regulation in the book. Passengers aren't authorized to—" "Captain," Colonel Briggs' voice cut through the objection, "you are hereby authorized to provide Spectre with any technical assistance she requires. That's a direct order from Atlantic Fleet Command." The words carried the weight of official sanction, but Claire heard something else in Briggs' tone: personal conviction. Despite their professional disagreements, despite her unconventional methods that had driven him to distraction, he trusted her judgment when lives hung in the balance. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. Just do what you do best." Claire moved to the navigation console, her fingers finding controls she hadn't touched in years but remembered with muscle memory precision. Around her, she could feel the attention of the flight crew, not the casual curiosity of earlier, but the focused respect of professionals watching a master at work. "Falcon Squadron, stand by for coordinate transmission. We're going to turn their own jamming network against them." As her hands moved across the instruments, adjusting frequencies and signal protocols with the confidence of someone who designed similar systems, Captain Ruiz found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman from seat 14A. This wasn't a former analyst or support officer. This was someone who'd operated at the highest levels of military intelligence, someone whose expertise had shaped the very countermeasures they were now employing. "Signal disruption in 3, 2, 1, mark." The change was immediate. The subtle vibration that had been affecting the aircraft systems smoothed out, and the interference static on the radio frequencies cleared like fog lifting from a mountain lake. "Outstanding, Spectre," came Briggs' voice, and Claire heard in it not just professional approval, but something approaching awe. "Falcon Squadron, target platforms are breaking formation. Jamming network is compromised." But even as the immediate threat receded, Claire knew this was just the beginning. Whoever was behind the coordinated attack had resources and planning capabilities that suggested a much larger operation. And now they knew that their carefully designed system had been neutralized by someone with intimate knowledge of their equipment and tactics. "Marcus," she said, "this isn't over. They'll adapt and try again." "I know, which is why I'm hoping you'll consider coming back to work, officially." Claire looked out at the lights of the escort fighters, still maintaining protective formation around their flight, and felt the familiar pull of purpose that had once defined her life. But she also remembered why she'd walked away: the cost of constant crisis, the weight of decisions that determined who lived and who died. "One crisis at a time, Colonel," she said. "Let's get these passengers safely to Frankfurt first." But even as she said it, she could feel something shifting inside her. The recognition that some kinds of expertise came with responsibilities that extended beyond personal choice. 27 minutes later, as United Flight 442 approached the heart of what Claire now recognized as a carefully constructed electronic warfare trap, the situation deteriorated rapidly. "Spectre, we're losing telemetry on multiple systems," Lieutenant Patel reported, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Whatever they're doing, they're escalating." Through the cockpit windows, the escort fighters were still visible, but their formation had tightened considerably. Claire could see the subtle adjustments in their positioning that indicated heightened threat assessment. They were preparing for possible engagement.
In the passenger cabin, the effects were becoming harder to hide. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, and the entertainment systems had failed completely. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, but Claire could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they exchanged glances when they thought passengers weren't watching. Ethan Marshall had returned to seat 14B after Claire's extended absence, but his laptop screen remained dark, another casualty of the electronic interference. Around him, other passengers were discovering that their phones showed no signal, their portable devices were malfunctioning, and the plane's internal communication systems were producing nothing but static. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Ruiz announced, "we're experiencing some temporary technical difficulties with our communications equipment. Please remain calm and in your seats while we work to resolve the situation." But Claire knew they were past the point where the situation could be resolved through standard procedures. She studied the interference patterns on the navigation display, her mind automatically running through the tactical analysis that had once been second nature. "Marcus," she said into the headset, "they're not just jamming us randomly. Look at the signal timing." Colonel Briggs's voice crackled through the static. "What am I looking for?" "Pattern recognition. They're synchronizing with our navigation system's update cycles. Every time our equipment tries to establish position, they're feeding us false data during the brief window when we're most vulnerable to input corruption." The realization hit the military controllers simultaneously. This wasn't just electronic warfare. It was a precisely orchestrated hijacking attempt using navigation spoofing to guide aircraft to predetermined locations without the crew ever realizing their instruments were lying. "Estimated time before they achieve full navigation control?" Briggs asked. Clay ran the calculations quickly. 12 minutes, maybe less. Once they establish complete signal dominance, we'll be flying wherever they want us to go, and our instruments will show us exactly where we think we're supposed to be. Recommendations? For a moment, she hesitated. The solution she was formulating would require split-second coordination between multiple military assets and precise timing of electronic countermeasures. It was the kind of operation she'd designed dozens of times during her active duty, but always with specially trained personnel who'd rehearsed similar scenarios. Now she was asking a commercial flight crew and an ad hoc squadron of fighters to execute complex tactics they'd never practiced. "We turned their precision against them," she said finally. "Falcon Squadron, I need you to establish what we used to call a signal trap. Coordinate your jamming equipment to create false interference signatures that mask our actual countermeasures." "Ma'am," came a new voice, younger than the others. "This is Falcon 5. Could you clarify the technical requirements for—" "Falcon 5, Lieutenant Patel's voice cut through sharply. "You're speaking to Spectre. Whatever she tells you to do, you do it exactly as instructed. That's not a request. The young pilot's response was immediate. Ma'am, yes ma'am, Falcon 5, ready for instruction. Claire felt a familiar surge of something between pride and responsibility. This was what she'd missed. Not the crisis itself, but the trust, the seamless coordination of talented people working together toward a common goal. The knowledge that her expertise could be the difference between success and catastrophe. All Falcon units, establish electronic countermeasure pattern Delta 7. United 442, I need you to maintain exactly 478 knots airspeed and adjust heading to 265 degrees on my mark. Captain Ruiz looked at his instruments. Ma'am, that heading takes us directly into the interference zone. Trust me, Claire said, and something in her voice made the objection die in his throat. Falcon Squadron initiate signal trap in 3, 2, 1, mark. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The sophisticated jamming network that had been gradually assuming control of their navigation systems suddenly found itself feeding false data into a void. Their carefully calibrated interference patterns were being absorbed and redirected by the military aircraft, creating a null space where United 442 could operate with clear instruments. Outstanding, Colonel Briggs's voice carried a note of amazement. Claire, their entire network just went dark. How did you? They built a system designed to gradually assume control without detection. But gradual takeover requires constant signal adjustment. When we fed their own interference back to them through the squadron's countermeasures, their automated systems interpreted it as system failure and shut down to prevent detection. The silence that followed her explanation was filled with the unspoken recognition of tactical brilliance. She'd turned a sophisticated electronic warfare attack into a self-defeating system using principles the attackers had never anticipated. United 442, this is Falcon Leader. You are cleared for normal navigation. Threat has been neutralized. But as the immediate crisis passed, Claire felt the familiar weight of aftermath settling over her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the tactical problem-solving was fading, replaced by the complex emotions that had driven her away from this life in the first place. She'd just prevented what could have been a massive terrorist operation, saved hundreds of lives across
multiple flights, and demonstrated capabilities that clearly hadn't diminished during her civilian years. And somehow, that success felt heavier than failure would have. In the aftermath of the crisis, as the electronic interference faded and normal flight operations resumed, something unprecedented began to happen across the military communication channels. Word of Spectre's involvement had spread beyond Falcon Squadron, reaching other units monitoring the North Atlantic corridor, then rippling outward through the network of pilots and controllers who remembered the name. Spectre, this is Raven Squadron, currently patrolling Grid 6-6. Ma'am, it's an honor to share the same airspace. Spectre, Thunderbase acknowledging. Your tactical manual from the Kosovo operation is still required reading here. Ma'am, this is Strike Leader Actual. Half my squadron trained on scenarios you developed. Thank you for your service. One by one, voices emerged from across the Atlantic theater. Pilots from different squadrons, different missions, different generations of service, all unified by recognition of what her code name represented. Claire listened in growing amazement as the tributes poured in, not just acknowledgement of her past achievements, but gratitude for the foundation she'd laid for their current capabilities. Lieutenant Sarah Patel's voice cut through the chorus. All stations, this is Valkyrie. I'm speaking for Falcon Squadron when I say that tonight proved what we've always known. Spectre's legacy isn't just history, it's still saving lives. Ma'am, it's been the honor of our careers to serve alongside you, even briefly. Colonel Briggs's voice followed, carrying decades of professional respect that had survived their personal clashes. Spectre, this is Command. Your tactical analysis tonight prevented what intelligence now estimates could have been a coordinated attack on up to 15 civilian aircraft. The countermeasures you developed in real time have been transmitted to all Atlantic Patrol units for future reference." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note of something deeper than professional courtesy. "Claire, you walked away because you said the cost was too high. Tonight, you saved more lives than you lost in Montenegro. Maybe it's time to stop counting." The words hit Claire with unexpected force. For 4 years, she'd carried the weight of the mission that had convinced her to leave. 18 lives lost because her tactical plan, brilliant as it was, hadn't accounted for every variable. She'd saved 247 people that day, but the 18 who died had defined her memory of the operation. Now, listening to the voices of pilots who still used her methods, who'd built their own capabilities on foundations she'd laid, she began to understand that her legacy had never been about the missions that went wrong. It had been about the countless operations that succeeded because of principles she'd established, tactics she'd developed, and protocols that continued to save lives long after she'd stopped carrying responsibility for them. Captain Ruiz, listening to the exchange from his pilot's seat, finally understood who had been sitting quietly in 14A for the past 6 hours. This wasn't just a former military officer. This was someone whose expertise had shaped current operational doctrine, whose reputation commanded instant respect from pilots across multiple services. Without making it official, without announcing it to the cabin, he reached over and offered her a precise military salute. Claire saw the gesture and returned it with equal precision, a moment of recognition between professionals who understood the weight of command and the cost of responsibility. "Falcon Squadron, this is Spectre. Thank you for your service tonight. It's been my honor to work with you again." But as the formal acknowledgments continued, Claire felt something she hadn't expected. Not the burden of unwanted recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her decision to step away from active duty hadn't diminished the respect she'd earned. If anything, her temporary return to tactical command had reminded everyone, including herself, why her expertise had been valued in the first place. The squadron began to disperse as normal flight operations resumed, but their departure felt more like a ceremonial honor guard standing down than a simple tactical withdrawal. Each pilot signed off with personal acknowledgement. "Falcon 2, departing station. It's been an honor, Spectre." "Falcon 3, returning to base. Thank you for everything, ma'am." "Falcon 4, clear. You're a legend for good reason." As the last fighter disappeared into the night sky, Claire removed the headset and handed it back to Captain Ruiz. The cockpit felt strangely quiet after the intensity of military coordination, but there was peace in the silence, the peace of a job completed successfully. "Ma'am," Ruiz said quietly, "I don't know what you did during your service, but I know what you did tonight. Thank you." Claire nodded, then looked back toward the passenger cabin. "I should return to my seat. Let the passengers think it was just a routine technical difficulty." But as she moved toward the cockpit door, she realized that returning to anonymity would be more complicated than simply walking back to row 14. The past 3 hours had changed something fundamental, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. Frankfurt International Airport materialized out of the pre-dawn darkness like a city of lights suspended in time. The landing was smooth, professional, unremarkable, exactly the kind of routine conclusion that commercial passengers expected after 8 hours of flight.
As the Boeing 767 taxied toward the gate, most travelers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings, checking phones for messages, and mentally transitioning from the suspended reality of flight to the demands of destination. Claire Donovan sat in seat 14A and watched the ground crew positioning equipment around their gate, but her mind was still processing the events of the night. In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from anonymous passenger to tactical coordinator, from forgotten analyst to remembered legend. The transition felt both natural and surreal, like putting on clothes that still fit perfectly despite years in storage. "Well," Ethan Marshall said, closing his laptop and turning toward her, "that was significantly more eventful than I expected when I booked this flight." Claire looked at him, studying his face for signs of the journalist's instinct to pursue a story. But what she saw was something different, genuine respect mixed with understanding that some experiences were meant to remain private. "You're not going to write about this," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he replied without hesitation. "Some stories are bigger than the people who experience them. This one belongs to you, not to my readers." She felt a flicker of surprise at his restraint. Most journalists would have been formulating headlines and calculating the career impact of stumbling onto a story involving covert military operations and legendary intelligence officers. But Ethan Marshall was looking at her with the expression of someone who'd witnessed something he didn't fully understand, but respected completely. "Thank you," she said. "Can I ask you one question, though, just for my own curiosity?" Claire nodded. "Was it worth it, walking away from all that? Recognition, responsibility, whatever you want to call it?" She considered the question as passengers began filing past them toward the exit. 4 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Tonight, I'm not sure anymore." The cabin had nearly emptied when Captain Ruiz appeared in the aisle, still wearing his pilot's uniform, but looking somehow different, more confident, more settled than he had appeared during the crisis hours. "Miss Donovan," he said formally, then dropped his voice. "Claire, I wanted to thank you personally before you disappeared into the terminal. You handled the situation professionally, Captain. You didn't need me." Ruiz shook his head. "I've been flying commercial routes for 12 years, and tonight was the first time I felt like I was really flying again, not just following procedures and managing systems, but actually leading through a crisis. Watching you work, it reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place." He extended his hand, and when she shook it, his grip carried the firm acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another. "If you ever decide you miss the excitement, commercial aviation could use more people who understand what real leadership looks like." Claire shouldered her messenger bag and moved toward the exit, but paused at the cockpit door. Through the windows, she could see the maintenance crews beginning their routine inspection of the aircraft, checking systems that would never show evidence of the sophisticated electronic warfare that nearly claimed them. By morning, Flight 442 would just be another routine transatlantic crossing in the logbooks. But she knew that somewhere in classified files, tonight's events would be analyzed, documented, and added to the growing intelligence database on electronic warfare threats. Her countermeasures would be studied, refined, and integrated into new defensive protocols. Lives would be saved by lessons learned from this crisis, and most of the people affected would never know her name. The terminal at Frankfurt was beginning its daily awakening as early morning flights prepared for departure. Claire walked through the customs area with the same careful anonymity she'd maintained for 4 years, answering questions politely, showing her passport, collecting her checked luggage. To the officials processing her entry, she was exactly what her paperwork indicated, an American consultant traveling on business.
She found a quiet corner near the departure gates and pulled out her cell phone, scrolling through missed calls and messages that had accumulated during the flight. Most were routine, confirmations of meetings, updates from colleagues, the ordinary communications of civilian life. But buried among them was a text message from a number she hadn't seen in years. "Call when you're ready. The door is always open. MB." Marcus Briggs. Even after their professional reunion over the crisis, he was offering her a path back to the world she'd left behind. Claire stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. But as she walked through the terminal toward the taxi stand, she found herself thinking about Lieutenant Patel's voice, young, eager, carrying forward traditions and techniques that Claire had helped establish. About Captain Ruiz rediscovering confidence in his own capabilities after watching her work. About the squadron of pilots who still spoke her code name with respect, who'd built their own expertise on foundations she'd laid years ago. She'd spent 4 years believing that walking away had been her only choice, that the cost of responsibility had become too high to bear. But tonight had shown her something different, that influence and impact weren't always about carrying the weight of command. Sometimes it was about creating systems and teaching principles that continued to matter long after the teacher had moved on.
Near the taxi stand, a businessman struggled with an unwieldy rolling suitcase that had lost a wheel. Without thinking, Claire stopped to help him manage the awkward load, holding it steady while he adjusted the straps. "Danke," he said gratefully. "Thank you." "No problem," she replied, and continued walking. It was such a small interaction, barely worth noticing, but as she settled into the back seat of a Mercedes taxi and gave the driver an address in downtown Frankfurt, Claire realized that this was also a kind of service, the everyday assistance that ordinary people provided to each other, far removed from tactical briefings and military coordination, but no less valuable for its simplicity. "American?" the taxi driver asked in accented English, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes," she said. "Business or pleasure?" Claire looked out the window at the German countryside sliding past in the early morning light. Neat farmland and small towns, peaceful and ordered, the kind of landscape that existed because people like her had once worked to ensure its safety. "Both," she said finally. Her phone buzzed with another text message, this one from a colleague in Frankfurt confirming their lunch meeting. Normal business, civilian concerns, the life she'd built away from crisis and command. But now it felt different, not like hiding from her past, but like choosing a different way to serve. The taxi turned into Frankfurt's business district, and Claire could see the conference center where she'd be spending the next 3 days consulting on telecommunications security for a European banking consortium. Civilian work, but work that mattered. Different from preventing terrorist attacks or coordinating military operations, but still about protecting people. Still about using specialized knowledge to make the world marginally safer. As they pulled up to her hotel, Claire tipped the driver and collected her luggage. The lobby was efficient and anonymous, full of business travelers beginning their day. She checked in quickly, accepted her room key, and headed for the elevators. But as the doors closed, and she found herself alone for the first time since boarding Flight 442, Claire allowed herself a moment of honest reflection. Tonight had reminded her of who she'd been, what she'd accomplished, and the respect she'd earned through years of exceptional service. It had also shown her that walking away hadn't diminished that legacy. If anything, it had preserved it, allowing her contributions to grow and evolve in the hands of new generations. The elevator reached her floor, and Claire walked down the hallway to her room, her footsteps quiet on the carpeted corridor. She inserted her keycard, entered the modest business class room, and set her luggage on the rack provided. On the desk by the window, she placed her phone, her passport, and the paperback copy of The Kite Runner she'd been reading during the flight. Tomorrow, she would attend meetings, review technical specifications, and provide expert consultation on security protocols that would protect millions of financial transactions. Important work, meaningful work,
but work that would never require her to use the code name Spectre. She opened the window slightly, letting in the cool German morning air, and looked out over the city awakening below. Somewhere over the Atlantic, pilots were filing mission reports that would mention her involvement in neutralizing a sophisticated terrorist operation. Somewhere in classified databases, her tactical innovations would be studied and refined. Somewhere in the ongoing work of keeping people safe, her influence would continue to matter. But here, in this hotel room in Frankfurt, she was simply Claire Donovan again, a consultant with specialized knowledge, a woman who'd chosen to use her expertise in quieter ways, a former legend who had discovered that sometimes the greatest service was teaching others to carry on the mission. She pulled the curtains closed, set her alarm for 7 a.m., and prepared for sleep. In 6 hours, she would wake up and begin 3 days of routine business meetings. By the end of the week, she would return to Washington, D.C., and resume the civilian life she'd carefully constructed.
But she would carry with her the knowledge that when crisis had demanded it, Spectre had returned, not with fanfare or publicity, but with the quiet competence that had always defined her best work. And in the voices of Lieutenant Patel and Colonel Briggs, in the respect of Captain Ruiz and the trust of Falcon Squadron, she'd heard something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Confirmation that her contributions had mattered, that her legacy was secure, and that walking away had been not an abandonment of duty, but a different way of serving. The last thing she heard before sleep was the distant sound of aircraft engines, commercial flights beginning their own journeys across the morning sky, carrying passengers who would never know how many people worked quietly to ensure their safety. Some stories, Claire thought as consciousness faded, were best told not in headlines or official reports, but in the simple fact that people arrived safely at their destinations, protected by systems and protocols developed by those who chose to work in the shadows. Spectre had always been most effective when no one knew she was there. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.